therefore, we'll have to keep, particularly in today's context, is to keep in mind growth and growth-related priorities, even as equally looking at controlling inflation. The fiscal deficit needs also to be restrained. Otherwise, inflation is not going to be wholesomely defeated or brought under control. The second of the priorities I'd like to put before you is increasing the emphasis on investments to spur growth. That's a sure shot route to achieving growth, sustained growth, and therefore investment in physical assets needs to be substantially raised, driven by the public sector if it is possible, and complemented by private sector. So the public sector may also have to take the lead until the private sector steps in. That's a story which is happening in India, and you see unrelentingly Government of India looking focused for increased public expenditure. But I can see that it is also now attracting private sector to come in and invest. To have a large multiplier impact on recovery and growth, therefore, investments is the best answer. The labor force participation and also improving on productivity simultaneously with increasing investments are two essentials to go with it, and labor force participation rates will have to therefore increase, for which enabling policies will have to be made. Post-pandemic, only a few countries will have the fiscal room to increase public expenditure on capital, yet it has got to be increased. There is no way of looking at constraints and saying I can't have expenditure from public for capital increase. The third of the important factor is raising investments, even as I say for public expenditure, for investments, for infrastructure. I would say focusing on investments in public health and education is a very key priority for sustained growth. So globally, I think the focus should be on health and education. It is not as if only India, because it's part of the emerging market world, it has to spend on health and education. Health systems are collapsing even in developed countries, and unless money goes into that, we will have a health crisis. And it's no good to differentiate between developed countries and developing countries. Health is got to be kept up always in a very robust and dynamic fashion. Skilling also is important, and that's why I group it under education and health as two important public expenditure items. The fourth one, which I would say as very key to sustaining growth, is climate change finance. I know the B20, I know the climate-related groups, and also others are talking about climate financing. We've started with a sense of pessimism only because the 100 billion has never come on the table, but there are always the other side which says we didn't know what this 100 billion is going to go for. It has never been defined. There are legitimate arguments being put forward saying that is why the 100 billion has never come on the table. But the fact remains that few countries, and I'm happy to say India is one among them, have funded their own commitments given in Paris and fulfilled their nationally determined commitments with their own resources. Not very many countries are going to be lucky to do that. And for India too, the transition period is going to be a challenge if we have to fund it all on our own resources. So financing climate change is a key factor for sustaining global economic recovery. Now, this money is one thing when we say we need the money for transition as well, but we need the money for technology as well. We need the money for transition, we need the money for technology as well. And then if both these are made available, very many countries which are in no position to, fund their own climate commitments can also give us a positive result. But climate is such a matter that no country on its own fulfilling the goals will suffice. It has to be global action. No individual country can sufficiently do enough for the global shortcomings. So it has to be everybody on their own, equally, everybody contributing for the whole. The fifth point, which I think is very important towards sustaining global economic recovery, is diversification of supply chains. The world in the next 50, 60 years cannot afford one more jolt in the supply chains, or one more disruption to the supply chains will be ruinous. And therefore, unless we quickly diversify our supply chains, well-functioning international markets with resilient and efficient supply chains are the ones who can help us in sustaining our growth. So we need to cushion ourselves sufficiently against any shock that can happen. So it is a old wisdom, putting all the eggs in one basket is not going to help. For the safety of everybody and also for ensuring global stability, and therefore, of course, talking about global recovery, we need to have supply chain. Now, in particular, strengthening India's position in the global economy over the next decade, I have just a few thoughts to share with you, and I'm sure you have been discussing it since the morning, and you'll have probably a lot more practical solutions to come up with, which I'll be happy to hear when the outcome reports come. India is growing forward, anchored on Atmanirbhar Bharat. I think the initial doubts that very many people had about Atmanirbhar Bharat, whether it is an inward-looking India that we are planning, whether we are going to stop imports, are quelled, they are completely dispelled. Atmanirbhar is more for India to be sure that every sector of its economy can grow, whether if some essential imports have to come in, we are not going to stop that. So we are focusing our approach in building an Atmanirbhar Bharat. We are focusing on infrastructure and also making sure compliance burden come down. So several sincere pursuit of reforms so that compliance is not going to be continuing to be a festering problem for us. We did remove a lot of archaic laws. Continuously engagement with industry gives us clue where we have to remove the burden, but that's an ongoing work, and I wouldn't think it's going to reach its conclusion too quickly because it's a dynamic situation there. Enough is said about National Infrastructure Pipeline and also the monetization pipeline. PM Gati Shakti program is also something in which we are getting layers of information as to where the obstruction for speedily taking a decision lie, and it is easy for us to cull them out. So we have adopted a transparent methodology so that compliance burden is eased out and also speedy decision making can happen. We've come up with production linked incentives, and also the particular thing which I would like to put forth before you is the semiconductor mission which was announced in 2021, and it had an outlay of 76,000 crores, approximately $10 billion US. This is expected to pay the way for India's growing presence in global electronics value chain, and I'm sure the industry is quite seized of this, and you would leverage it to your advantage. We recognize that the FDIs, the foreign capital flows, are vital for our growth story. So simplification and rationalization of foreign portfolio investors regulations are going through reforms. Increase in aggregate foreign investment limits are also being looked into. We have looked at introduction of a common application form for registration of FPIs and opening up of new channels of debt investments like the voluntary retention route and fully accessible route. So I think India stands as an attractive destination for FDIs. We are working to provide a transparent and predictable and easily comprehensible policy framework. A lot of emphasis has been placed on GIFT IFSC. Many of you who have visited the GIFT city know that that place is changing rapidly, particularly post this real-time connection between Singapore and India's exchange at the GIFT city. A lot of change is happening and it is worth looking at it. Fintech sector and also the digital markets are something which are ever expanding, giving scope for all of us to know how we can build on opportunities. The last point that I'd like to highlight, critically, India's digital public infrastructure has been welcomed by every country. In fact, in the G20, I wouldn't be wrong in saying that every one of my counterpart has come before me to say what India has achieved, both in scale and the speed, in putting through a digital infrastructure which is publicly held, government held, but which is accessible for private use. And it is now adapted by common Indian citizens. The combination of the three, publicly held, available for private use, and being adopted by common Indian buyer and seller, have really helped India's digital story. And there's a great lot of appreciation about the way in which we've gone about it. India Stack is now actually branding India outside, and we are happy to have knowledge shared with whoever who wishes to see how it might be, or at least one of the bricks in the India Stack could help their own economies. I think eventually, to sustain growth, global growth, and to have India's contribution to this sustained global growth, I think public-private collaboration is going to be very key. It's not just for the digital world, but even otherwise. No longer can governments do business in isolation. When I say business, even the governance-related business. No longer governments can do business in governance or carrying forward governance in isolation. It has to be with stakeholders equally taking ownership of what is happening and pushing the world for a better world tomorrow, rather than leave it for all of us to wonder who's going to take the lead. So with those words, I thank you for giving me this opportunity. It was good sharing my thoughts with you.
People have been reaching out, wanting to ask questions, and Madam Finance Minister has agreed to take a couple of questions. Arvind Krishna has reached out. Arvind Krishna, CEO